What's up, everybody? Welcome to Jamie Kilstein Podcast. It is Thursday. We had to record a bunch of episodes in advance because we have left Los Angeles. Bye, you lizard scum. We're gone forever. We're en route to the desert where we will be making this podcast full time because of your support. David Pakman's on the show, host of the David Pakman Show. He's so fucking smart and wonderful and great, and I have a million things I want to talk to him about, which I will be doing very shortly on the Skype. We, of course, are not sponsored by Skype. We don't have any sponsors. We feel like it's a little hard to cover war crimes or to cover, hey, are you an immigrant child being held in a tiny cage and being denied soap and towels, and you want to write a letter begging for help? Well, I'll tell you how to stamp that letter. Stamps.com. Are you a tiny immigrant child being held in a cage and sleeping on a dirty floor? You know what that tiny child would rather be sleeping on? A Casper mattress. Are you a tiny child who would love to be an entrepreneur using a website like Squarespace, but instead you're being forcibly detained by the U.S. government, the greatest country in the world? Squarespace.com. Use promo code HELP ME. Get me the fuck out of here. I'm just a kid on a cage. Squarespace.com. Okay. Before we get to David Pakman, I want to shout out, this is the coolest thing that could have happened before we left LA, because it would be so fucking easy to be a screaming liberal or a screaming conservative. We would get so much more traffic, so much more money, but we're sticking to our principles. We're trying not to be assholes on this show, and I feel like we were rewarded. Like, producer girlfriend Emma and I celebrated all night when we got this. We have a new $50 a month member. Holy fucking shit. Huge. Ed, right? But then Ed writes this email. Jamie, I know you would be really happy to hear that you have another $50 per month from a very liberal 20-something super cool chick. I mean, think girl with the dragon tattoo, only American, so there aren't any weird symbols over anything I write. I know this would make you happy, but unfortunately for you, I'm another older white guy. It gets worse. I'm conservative. Even worse, I'm in the military. Sorry. I listen to your show because while I don't always agree with you, I agree with your approach. I enjoy being on the journey with you as you from a political life philosophy of your own. Here's my ask. Stay honest and don't pander to me or any other conservative. In return, I promise that even if you piss me off, I'll keep my donation going for at least a year. Good luck on your new life with girlfriend producer Emma. I wish you both the best. Signed, I'm nicknaming you Ed with the dragon tattoo. That is the coolest email, especially the ask, don't pander to me. You're still going to get my money. I've had liberals cancel because they've disagreed with something I've said. So this is just fucking awesome. It's what we're trying to build on the show. I don't agree with anything you say, but I like you. Here's some money to keep the lights on and to keep the show growing. That's fucking really, really cool. So thank you, Ed, with the dragon tattoo. If you guys want to support the show as well, you can go to patreon.com/Jamie Kilstein Podcast for as little as $5 a month. You can keep the conversation going on Twitter at Jamie Kilstein. You can write into the show, all that good stuff. But the best way to support the show is patreon.com/Jamie Kilstein Podcast. Thank you guys for everything. Now I present to you the host of the David Pakman Show, which all of you should check out on iTunes. You can follow him on Twitter, dpakman. David.
How you doing?
How's it going, man?
Good.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, no problem.
I feel like me and you probably started before me, but I feel like we could have been friends and something happened. I assume it was my fault, but we were in like kind of the same new liberal podcaster world like a decade ago. Like you were on email chains. That's how I found your email. It was like me, you, Jay from Best of the Left, and we kind of all like started this shit together.
Yep. Yeah, I actually saw Jay pretty recently, and that rings a bell. I mean, that totally sounds like how we would have been linked up years ago.
But then I don't know why. So here's my guess, which I'm not happy about. I assume because like my old show was like trying to be like the rebel show, and I think I was just secretly jealous. Where I'm like, who's that fucking good-looking guy who's really articulate and well-spoken while I'm trying to tell dick jokes and like tell Bush to suck my asshole? And instead of reaching out and becoming friends with you, I just like silently pretended you weren't on those email chains.
Well, that's it takes a big person to admit that. Although I would question whether that was exactly what was going on, but it makes for a good story anyway.
It does make for a good story, but here's what's cool, and this is why I wanted you on the show. So we've both been on Joe Rogan's show, and which means we've both had good conversations with Joe Rogan, then gotten home, had our liberal fans yell at us that we talked to someone on the alt-right, and then had his conservative fans call us like cuck snowflakes.
Yeah, that's basically how it went down.
It is, right? Okay. But what I didn't know about you, and I've only recently started listening to your podcast, which I'm a fan of now, but what I didn't know, and here's where I'm kind of glad we connected now that we both have this in common, and what I want to talk to you about first is that we both, while still being very liberal, have conservative fans and have more moderate fans. I know my trajectory and how that happened with me, but how did that happen with you, and why do you think that's actually kind of cool and important? Because I feel like a lot of people on the left get pissed off if you're even talking to conservatives.
Well, I don't know that my conservative or moderate following is actually that big. I mean, I know anecdotally that I have some, and even some paid subscribers, because unless they're lying, I mean, they tell me what their views are, and they say, even if they don't agree with my conclusions, you know, they still want to support the work I'm doing because they think that in the sort of marketplace of ideas, at least I'm coming to it with a progressive perspective that is genuine and in good faith informed by what I claim that it's informed by, rather than sort of playing politics in the way that I think some people don't like. But I actually don't think that I have any really significant moderate or conservative following beyond, you know, an anecdotal one. I think there's definitely lots of right-wingers that regularly comment on my content, and it's mostly negative comments. So in that sense, like, there is an audience, but I don't know that they'd really consider themselves like my core supporters in any serious way.
But I would say having paid, I mean, you know how small the percentage is of listeners to paid supporters. Having paid supporters does mean you are doing something to at least not drive them away. So let me reframe the conversation to allow you to stay humble. To reframe the conversation, I never wanted to call myself a moderate, because I feel like moderate, and I feel like even when you talk about compromise, people visualize sort of the worst of the Democrat, you know, like a sort of like Joe Lieberman type or Chuck Schumer type, compromising with like a slimy Republican, and they both come together to fuck over everybody else, right? But I do think that it is important, and there is kind of a new group of people who at the very least aren't willing to, like, on my old show, if I had someone who was like, hey man, I don't agree with you, but like, I'm a conservative and I voted for Bush, I would be like, here's your fucking money back, you bigot. And I wouldn't have even listened to them. But I do think it's important, and you go hard after Republicans on your show, so I don't think you're pandering to them or you're on the center right. But I do think that there is something important about being able to have a conversation that's not going to drive conservatives away, especially if your goal is present liberal ideas.
Definitely, yeah. And I regularly engage with right-wing guests and right-wing callers. I mean, we don't screen calls in the sense that anybody who wants to get on can get on, and their politics can be anything, and they can ask me anything that they want. Obviously, if they're trolling me, I'll just hang up on them if I don't want to talk to them. But in that sense, I have no problem engaging with people that have whatever political perspective. I mean, I do think that when we talk about compromise, it's like, you can't actually compromise with crazy people. And some of them, I would argue, you know, I'm all about the marketplace of ideas, but I said this on the Rogan program, some ideas are just so extreme that there's no serious way to kind of like include them in figuring out what it is that we should do on any particular issue.
Yeah.
And I'm not afraid to say that. I mean, I don't think anybody should be silenced. If they want to make a YouTube channel or have a podcast and say their crazy piece, by all means do it. But when the adults in the room have to figure out serious stuff, at a certain point, you've got to draw a line as to like what's allowed to even be seriously considered in terms of how we want to figure out the problems that we're facing right now.
Yes, and I feel like there are some issues that and no one should ever compromise on. Like, I remember when citizen radio was kind of like peak popular, and we were taking meetings with like MTV, and it was always like the low level people, like the new fresh out of college people who like loved the show. Like, I remember I walked into MTV, and our first meeting they had like The Nation on like their coffee table. Like, I don't know if they just brought it in because like we were coming in, and we're talking about like like what if we could get Noam Chomsky on MTV? And then once we got to like the VPs, it was very much like you have to show both sides, which I always hated hearing that. Because in my head, it was like there's no other side to homophobia. There's no other side to racism. Like, if you had Martin Luther King on, you wouldn't also have to balance it out by having the Klan on, is I think something we said in the meeting. But I feel like nowadays we've kind of gone in the extreme other direction where I've had a ton of conservatives write in and be like, hey, just so you know, like, I'm cool with gay people, and I'm kind of liberal on this issue. And when you have people saying that if you even talk to, like, a Joe Rogan or you talk to a conservative, and you've interviewed a lot of way more right-wing people, that by giving them a platform, you're essentially siding with them.
Yeah, I mean, I completely reject that, of course, and it all matters. What matters is what kind of a platform are you giving them? Are you saying take 15 minutes, say whatever you want, I'll just sit here and shut up? It's like, yeah, I would never do that, and I think that is a major, major problem. If what you're doing is saying, I think your ideas are dangerous, and I'm going to let you present them without interrupting you, and then I will tell you why I think that they're wrong. Okay, now we're talking, and I think we're doing something valuable.
Right. Do you find yourself... I see you do it sometimes. How do you balance on Twitter? Because what I love about your show, from what I've heard recently, is talking about ideas and concepts and not putting teams above. I talk about this on the show a lot, like not putting partisanship like above principles, right? And I think that's really important. How do you... I also feel like on Twitter and on social media, you're kind of rewarded the most for just attacking people, right? Like attacking other talk show hosts, attacking other people in your tribe. The liberals always get accused of like infighting. How do you balance that? Do you think if some of it is just, would you rather talk about ideas? Do you like sometimes when I try to describe a Twitter fight that's happening in like the progressive world to a friend of mine that's not on Twitter, they're like, who the fuck are any of these people? And I ask myself like, oh, does the Twitter liberal verse even matter when people are trying to like survive?
Yeah, I've been disconnecting from social media more and more on the weekends, and like starting that earlier and earlier, like halfway through the day on Friday or like Friday morning. And the most refreshing revelation is it just doesn't really matter. Like the real world and Twitter have an overlap, but at the same time, it's not a total overlap. And a lot of what is happening in these what seem like really important, it's sort of like in high school, everything seemed like, wow, this is going to basically determine my entire life as an adult. And then you get out of high school and you're like, oh wow, a lot of that stuff just really did not matter in any way.
Yeah, I'm not
I feel like there's a very similar dynamic with social media.
Yeah, exactly. The jock isn't still coming to kick my ass at the age of 37. It was so funny. I want to talk to you because I actually interviewed Dave Rubin last week, which I know you guys had many disagreements, and I wanted to talk to you about that, but it was kind of off topic, though. Cal Newport, who you've had on your show, who's a really good friend of mine, and he wrote Digital Minimalism, all about being off social media, has like a really big TED Talk about it, and he's going to come on this show as well. He texted me, and he was like, hey man, I really like that Dave Rubin interview. I've never heard him like talk about personal stuff like that. And I go, oh, cool, man. Yeah, I was like, a lot of people liked it, but I got a lot of shit from the left for even having him on. And I swear to God, Cal goes, people don't like Dave Rubin? And I was like, oh, what a magical world you live in to like not have any fucking idea. Like you can just listen to an interview and be like, that guy sounded nice without knowing like the years of baggage and like weird interpersonality feuds. And I wanted that. Like in that moment, I wanted to get off Twitter forever.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, as far as, one can be, I think that one of the great things that often happens when you meet people in person that you are often dealing with in different ways online is that it almost never even remotely resembles the online interactions. And I think that a lot of like troll culture and internet trolling just would not happen. It would immediately evaporate if more people met in person for the most part, like 98% of it, because in person people are for the most part not going to treat each other the way that they do on the internet. And, putting aside any particular like political disagreements or critiques that I've had of Dave Rubin or getting into the things he said about me or whatever, I mean, I think that in general, we would just be so much better off if there was more in-person interaction, although I understand why some people are skeptical of it because there are dangerous and crazy people out there, and you don't necessarily want to be interacting with those people on a regular basis.
But have you ever had, I don't know the answer to this, but have you ever had someone, I've literally had no one ever negatively confront me in real life. Even people who disagreed, the conversation was pretty fucking mellow.
Yeah, I think in real life, for the most part, my experience has been pretty similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Ruben because I definitely got shit for having him on from people who didn't listen to the show. I don't know the personal drama between you and him, or I see like Cedar going at, because I still talk to Sam. I still like Cedar going after him all the time. And what I tried to do, and I think the reason people liked the interview, was I did just want to talk about personal stuff, and I wanted to, if he said something I disagreed with, so he doesn't agree with the $15 minimum wage, instead of me just like shouting my talking points into his mouth, I was kind of like, why do you think that, and what do you think we should do for, the single mother who has to work 2 jobs? Like looking for a solution, right? But a lot of people were like, well, you should have countered him more. So what I would love to talk to you about, you identify as a capitalist, I believe, which is something that, again, is kind of like frowned upon on some parts of the left. What's your take on the minimum wage, on, balancing capitalism with social programs? What do you think the best approach for making sure that maybe successful people aren't punished, but also that we don't have these horrifying statistics of people who can barely get by and feed their kids?
Well, one thing I think it's important just to mention is when, capitalism is such a broad category that it encompasses so many different political ideologies. So I consider myself a social democrat, which means there's still private ownership of business. There's still, taking profit is okay, etc. But I think that taxation should be used in order to fund government programs that make sure nobody is sort of like falling too far down, and that we establish a minimum quality of life for everybody. So it's really important to say, when you say I'm a capitalist, that's correct, but I want to make sure I'm not a laissez-faire, no regulation, libertarian sort of vulture capitalist. And there's a difference between those things.
Yeah, when I was on that side of the left, anytime someone said capitalist, I literally just pictured like Mr. Burns shutting off Springfield's power, like every time. And then I remember the first time I was like, I think the left's gone too far, there was an article, I don't know if you remember this, but there was an article written, it was like an expose about Amy Goodman, the host of Democracy Now! And they were like, Amy Goodman makes $500,000 a year, or like something like that, like while claiming she's one of us. And I was like, motherfucker, Amy Goodman has been like attacked by rebel troops overseas. I want her to be a bazillionaire. Like I want Amy Goodman to be so rich. And I think that's the caricature that Republicans think a lot of Democrats are, where they just like don't want anyone to be successful. And then I think a lot of Democrats think that, or a lot of liberals think that all capitalists are these money-hungry monsters who want, billionaires to pay no taxes while poor people struggle to get food.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, there would be a lot of people who would be very surprised by what all sorts of people on the left make personally. And I think that I don't really know anything about Amy Goodman. I've been on her program once, and I don't really watch any shows, so I couldn't tell you anything that's happened on her program for who knows how many years, so I couldn't tell you what her economic views are or anything. But I think that there are many people in all of our audiences who would be extremely surprised by what some of the shows on the left and right make. So that's number one, and I think there is something a little bit unfair about singling out a show. I think this is sort of like when people talk about, hey, Bernie's a millionaire. So is he really the man of the people that he claims to be and his supporters claim that he is?
Right.
Well, what's his policy, right? I mean, like how much money he personally has is less important than what policy would he enact. And if he would enact policies that would be good for the lower class and the middle class and people who are sort of disadvantaged by some of the structural economic inequality that exists, then what does it matter if he has $1.1 or $1.3 million, mostly from this book that he wrote a few years ago? And I think that that's sort of the fundamental problem with those personal arguments.
Yeah, and I also think a lot of times, again, with Twitter, it turns into gossip. It turns into when you run out of things, everyone kind of wants to be the cool kid, They kind of want to be like Neo from The Matrix, who's like, oh, you're offended by this? Well, I'm offended by this times whatever. Like, there's nothing more edgy than to go after Amy Goodman, who supposedly is like the most progressive host on the left. And I think that's when the kind of liberal Twitter media, it goes from talking about ideas to just toxic gossip. It's just we think of it as a higher form of gossip because it's more intellectual or whatever,
Something happened that's similar. I don't remember exactly where with Noam Chomsky. And again, it's like whatever you think about Noam Chomsky, I don't know how old he is. He's got to be close to 90 years old.
He's old. Yes.
And there was an article about, hey, Noam Chomsky has a couple $1 million and he also has money parked in mutual funds that, are really broad index funds, so they have little pieces of oil companies and whatnot. I mean, listen, he's almost 90 years old. $2 million at that point is not crazy for someone who's been at the top level of academia for as long as he's been at the top level of academia. I agree with him on some things, disagree with him on some things, but I just don't understand. It's not an argument against any of his political positions to point out that he has mutual funds. You know what I mean?
Right. It's one of those like gotcha moments. So what is your sort of balance? What are the sort of pros of capitalism you see? The pros of more of a Bernie Sanders, of more a democratic socialist? Are there conversations to be had between the right and the left when it comes to this? Because again, I think a lot of conservatives think that socialism means that we're all going to be working in the fields, and a lot of people on the left think that capitalism means that poor people are just fucked as the rich get richer. What's your ideal balance?
I mean, first of all, you can't even dig into that until you start to get on equal footing as to what these terms even mean. So
Sure.
Way too often people say, we don't want to be socialists like in Scandinavia.
Right.
And every single one of those countries is a capitalist country. And when we talk about, as you say, the working in the field sort of idea, in countries that don't really depend on agriculture, what fields are there for people to even work in? I mean, it's just such a silly meme, and it's a good thing to get those out in the open and figure out what we are talking about and what we're not talking about. I mean, my fundamental view is that in modern day Earth, when you look at the countries that are doing the best in a few different ways, if we look at per capita income, if we look at self-reported happiness, if you look at crime and inequality, what the tendency is that the countries that are capitalist countries, in the sense that people can get very wealthy, there's private ownership of business, etc. But those countries decide that the priorities of taxation are going to be to make sure people have access to healthcare, to ensure that nobody goes below a certain standard of living. Those are the countries that in total balance are doing the best. And that's kind of my starting point for the model that we should be following.
So what are we missing from that right now?
Well, there's a few different things. I mean, number one, often immediately the right will say, well, we would have to raise taxes outrageously to be able to do any of the things that those countries do. And that's not really true. I mean, a lot of it is just priorities. And when you look at defense spending, when you look at the extraordinarily inefficient ways that a lot of our systems sort of just burn money, including the health insurance, healthcare system, and so many others, a lot of it is just saying we need to have some different priorities. We don't necessarily need 50 military bases in Germany. Right. We might be just as safe with 20. And then what those other 30 costs could actually be reallocated. So I think the wrong conversation is the one of how much do taxes have to go up. That being said, there are many proposals that, without changing anything about the defense industrial complex, with very small increases to taxes on employers and employees, you can do a lot of things that would be really stimulative to the economy. You know, when you look at a program to provide health care to everybody, and there's Medicare for All and a lot of other proposals as well. Yes, you can do it with a small increase in taxes on employees and employers. But what's often just completely missing from that conversation is on the other side of the ledger, there's no more premiums. There's no more employers paying for sometimes a third or half or two-thirds of someone's health insurance premium. There's no more co-pays. Yes, you're adding something, but you're also taking something away. Right. So I feel like when the conversation starts at how can we ever afford that, we're already missing the boat completely. And that's what a lot of other countries just understand inherently.
Well, that's a really good point. And I think that's kind of why I opened up with talking about having conservatives listening to both of us, or at least being open to it, because I think there's just a lot of misconceptions out there. You know, I remember covering Occupy Wall Street really heavily, and a lot of people I talked to thought that they were part of the 1%. And it's like, no. Like, when I was a small business owner, when I had my most money, I definitely got to that point when I got my first tax bill where I was like, oh, this is why people are Republicans. What ends up happening is those small business owners who aren't super wealthy but are doing well, they are getting fucked over a lot. And those taxes are going to a lot of things they would disagree with. I think what people don't understand is, for the most part, when we say, or at least when I say the 1%, I'm not even talking about the people you see in first class. Like, motherfucker, I get in first class because I got miles. Like, I'm talking about the people who have their own planes.
Well, that's actually much higher than so I think it's important to distinguish. You know, the 1%, I think, is around $400,000 a year in income.
Okay.
And I think, you know, it changes every year, but roughly that's what we're talking about. So, sure, we can talk about the 1%, but where you really start to see extremely disproportionate wealth is when you talk about like the 0.2% and the 0.1% and the 0.005%. And that's, you know, when you chart that out visually for people, they are shocked. There's some really interesting data from, I believe it's the Pew Research Center, where what they said to people is, tell us how you think the quintiles of income are divided. In other words, if you split up the population into 20% groups, the lowest 20%, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, and 80 to 100. And people just draw it. They draw lines. The country as a whole drastically, by orders of magnitude, underestimates the degree of inequality that exists at that top, within that top 20%. And it's like, if we don't even have an understanding of what the income distribution is, we're not going to be able to have productive conversations about what the laws should be and how taxation should work, because we don't even know what's going on in our own country.
Right. Well, the other thing I wanted to bring up, kind of along that same line, when you were talking about healthcare, is before when I like refused to engage with conservatives, I pretty much thought that if you didn't want some kind of universal health care, your health care plan was like, I want kids to die. Like, I want people to die. And after talking to conservatives, much like you were saying that you don't agree with a lot of the ways our tax dollars are spent, a lot of conservatives might even think our healthcare system is broken. Or at least they go, my family's okay. I don't trust the government because I don't like the way the government, you always hear like the DMV or the post office or whatever. Like, do you want your healthcare being run this way? So what's your response to that? Where when people, maybe they're not acting in bad faith. Maybe they, really do think that what we have now is the best for their families, for other families, and that the government, like they have many other things, are just going to fuck it up.
I mean, listen, if you look at satisfaction surveys with healthcare, you don't even really have to argue with the people that are really thrilled with the way healthcare works, because so few people are thrilled with the way healthcare works. There's no question. I mean, I think the bigger issue, which you're kind of alluding to, is this issue of who deserves what in this country. And you can agree that the system is broken, which I think, like you said, a lot of people on the right agree. But in the end, it's much more difficult to convince someone that we are all better off, even if people who don't, quote, deserve health care still get it, if it's an issue of morality and ethics for them. I mean, I think on the Joe Rogan program, I called it strict father morality, which is you can show people the economic sense of replacing the system we have with a system like that in many other European countries, where you get equal or better access, equal or better outcomes for significantly less money. But you can't convince them that it's okay for someone that doesn't work or can't afford the care currently to just get it, because that goes to a much deeper sort of moral and ethical framework that many conservatives have. And I genuinely don't know, actually, how to argue against that, because it's in many cases just so deeply ingrained.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who legitimately think, and I'm told there are studies that show that, with a certain amount of handouts or, access to free this or that healthcare education, which I believe are basic rights, it doesn't incentivize people to work. If you keep giving them food stamps, they're never going to go get a job. If you keep giving them welfare, they're never going to go get a job, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't agree with them yet. I will say, however, in my personal life, when I sort of stopped hanging out with just like liberal journalists, and I threw myself into MMA and was just hanging out with athletes and did have more of that pull yourself up by your bootstrap mentality, which I think a lot of conservatives were maybe raised a little more with. It did help my personal life, but at the same time, I'm a white guy who grew up middle class, and like I've had my struggles and so forth, but I also didn't start with both hands tied behind my back.
Yeah, I mean, so let's see. The problem is a lot of people can't even afford the bootstraps by which they could conceivably pull themselves up. And then the question is, what do you do about that? So there's actually a lot of studies about welfare programs as a disincentive. And here's the thing. I actually think that the conversation around people who will be disincentivized to be, quote, productive members of society by welfare programs is not the right conversation, because if you go back to any social welfare program, there will always be what's called the free rider problem. And the question is, do the free riders justify not having a program altogether whose net benefit is abundantly clear? So like, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
If you think of food stamps, which, by the way, is a terrible example, because food stamps, it's such a small amount of money per month, and it's also so economically stimulative because the money goes right back into local businesses, mostly grocery stores. But let's play out the food stamps example.
Sure.
Imagine that there is some percentage of people receiving food stamps that, because of those food stamps, aren't even going to try to get a job, because, I mean, I guess they don't need money for rent or to buy anything else, but they're happy with their food stamps, and that's going to disincentivize them.
They have they're just little fort made of ramen noodle packages, and that's how they live.
Right. I mean, it's so absurd that we're having a hard time even framing up a way to discuss this. But imagine those people exist.
Yeah.
The total economic benefit of the food stamp program, because the money goes right back into local businesses, combined with the fact that kids that are hungry in school don't learn nearly as well, making them not get good grades, making them eventually not productive members of society by this definition that we're kind of agreeing to. Who cares about some tiny percentage of people who are living the life on food stamps and choosing not to work? The overall economic benefit over the long term of the program is so huge that why are we even consuming any space in our minds with that small percentage of free riders? And the thing is, any social welfare system will have some free riders, but if it's well constructed, that is a percentage that we can predict ahead of time and does not derail the utility of the program.
Do you think that part of the reason that conservatives are so skeptical of liberal programs is because we've never, at least recently, had like a truly, like, let me use Obamacare for an example. I almost think that Medicare for all would have, even though it was framed as being infinitely more extreme than Obamacare, I think in the long run it would have gotten much more support, because even though Obamacare did a lot of good things like get rid of pre-existing conditions and allow people to stay on their parents' health care longer, like for me personally, that was another moment where I saw my health insurance bill under Obamacare and was like, I guess I become Republican, where I was like...
Well, here's the thing. So a couple things. I mean, you've got to remember that all healthcare premiums, all health insurance premiums were going up inside of the Obamacare exchanges and outside. So it's a really poor argument to say Obamacare was bad because Obamacare exchange plans got more expensive, because they got more expensive at a slower rate than the non-Obamacare plans. This is a bigger problem. Healthcare premiums have been going up for decades.
I never knew that, yeah. Or I never
My main criticism of Obamacare is it's fundamentally a corporatist center-right program. And in fact, it was actually originally conceived by the Conservative Heritage Foundation during the 1990s. Because think about fundamentally what it does. It says you must go and get a healthcare plan from a for-profit insurer.
Right,
it mandates that healthcare companies that make money off of people's health problems, that is, get tens of millions of new customers. So I agree with you that satisfaction with Medicare for all would have been much higher than with Obamacare. I think there is no way that when Obamacare was passed in 2010, Medicare for all would have passed. But I do believe that it's a much better program that people would be far more satisfied with.
Yeah, no, I'm not even saying, like, I was pro-Obamacare. I wanted Medicare for all, but I was like, this will be a stepping stone. You know, I mean, I wish Obama opened with wanting the Medicare for all instead of opening with the compromise, you know, which I feel like a lot of liberals wanted. But my greater point was, I think there are a lot of liberal policies that conservatives or centrists or libertarians assume we've tried when we really haven't. Like, Obamacare isn't anywhere near everyone having free health care. And I think if suddenly Republicans woke up and had free health care and had access to good doctors and we did it correctly, they'd be like, oh, holy shit. I think part of our problem is because we have so many corporatist Democrats corporate Democrats and Republicans who care more about profit for their donors, we haven't really experienced a lot of these social programs to their fullest.
Of course, and that's why we have to look at the countries that do have them. And then when you do, I mean, there's just no question at all about it. It's so cut and dry. Almost any of the different systems that, you know, the UK has a different system from Canada, which is different from Germany, which is different from Switzerland, and very different than Sweden and Norway. All of those programs have some issues that we can find, but they all increase access while reducing costs relative to our system.
Yeah, and if we actually cared about people, we could Bruce Lee that shit and, like, take what we like and disregard what we don't. And we could be innovators again. We could be capitalists. We could be competitive, and we could take the best from all those systems and create our own.
No question about it. And in fact, Wendell Potter, who's a former health insurance company executive for Cigna, he
Yeah.
writes in this book, Deadly Spin, about how I believe it's just after World War I and before World War II, the U.S. was rapidly heading in the direction of a system that would have been very much like the one that Germany has. But because at the time things were not going so well in the relationship between the U.S. and Germany, the idea was basically abandoned because, oh, that's too much like what the Germans are doing. And it led to the early stages of the system we have now, which we've not been able to get away from.
Jesus. Kind of on the same level, I have not been following the most recent free college education debate just because we are in the process of moving out of Los Angeles. Where are you on that?
Well, I think that there is a very interesting idea in saying that we're not talking about all college, but we're talking about state colleges and universities being tuition free for people who get in. And I think that this is a part that's often just totally missing from the conversation.
I was going to say, right away, I can tell you, you said like four things I have not heard in the conversation when it's the extreme sides just yelling at each other.
I mean, nobody is saying anybody who wants to go to Harvard goes to Harvard just by signing up, right? I mean, that's like, so what we're saying is if even state schools have admission requirements, and some of them are very difficult, and if you are accepted to one of these schools, you would be able to go tuition free. I think that the economic argument is a pretty straightforward one, which is that there are huge economic negatives to people, students being saddled with the absurd student loan debt that they currently have. It makes them, it forces them into making decisions that are not the right decisions for them in terms of career choices merely because they've got a student loan payment that's coming. That's not good for society to have people working jobs they don't really want to work. Yeah. It makes them have to spend money on interest paid to huge lenders rather than spending that money in their local communities, which is much more economically stimulative. So I totally get the economic idea behind it. I think that it's more a question of political viability and political will. And also, it's okay that not everybody should go to college. Like I've had this conversation with presidential candidate Andrew Yang. I had this conversation with Joe Rogan. I'm not about make everyone go to college. I can't deny that we are increasingly in the United States not competitive in science and math with many other countries. That at some point is going to have to be dealt with one way or the other, and technological automation is going to impact that. Like that, we can have all those conversations. It's okay that not everybody is cut out for college, and we should also be figuring out how to support people working in trades and in other areas, bearing in mind that many of those jobs are open to or liable to be automated away in the next 15 years.
Right. And also, like, So I dropped out of high school, and when I talked to my dad about going to college, well, the first thing this was an actual thing. I remember my dad was like, "What if comedy falls through? You need a backup plan." And I very earnestly said, "I have a backup plan, Dad. I play in a band." So I wasn't exactly like the most level-headed kid in the world, but what I did say that finally convinced him, if I went to college, even if I went to college for music, but if I just went because I thought I was supposed to go, I would have ended up being an alcoholic riddled in debt. Instead, I got to start stand-up at 17. I got a head start. Or even a worse example, and I'm excited that you brought this up because I don't hear it talked about often, but a worst example is the drummer in my band was like the most talented drummer on the fucking planet. And I thought he was going to like hit the road with me. His parents wanted him to go to college. He couldn't afford college, so he joined the military. This was pre-September 11th. Joined the military so he could get into college. Then the war in Iraq starts. He goes over to the war in Iraq, started fucking drinking heavily, blah, blah, blah. Comes back and just wants to play drums. But now it's 8 years later with a drinking problem after seeing his friends die. Just because we're kind of told that you have to go to college to be successful.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that is ingrained pretty early for a lot of people. And the truth is that in many fields, you do have to go to college in order to be successful. Sure. But the point is, I think if we even zoom out from this a little bit, things are changing significantly in the world of employment and just the relationship of humans to work. And as without being a technological dystopian and imagining that every job is going to get automated away in the next 5 years, there are many jobs which are going to be superfluous or unnecessary as a result of technology. And bigger picture, at some point there's going to have to be an accounting of what should the relationship of humans in particularly rich Western countries like the United States to this idea of having to work 40 hours in a regular job in order to support yourself. No candidate is really talking about that.
Right. Jesus, yeah. Okay, totally switching gears. I was listening to, I haven't heard your most recent episode, but I was listening to your episode on Iran. I think you put it out on Sunday. Let's talk about that. Are we going to fucking go to war with Iran? Does anybody want war in Iran that's not these like old hawks that are in the Trump administration? How do you see this playing out? What the fuck is happening?
I hope that we don't go to war with Iran. One interesting thing is that Donald Trump will often use very aggressive rhetoric with a lot of different countries, North Korea as an example,
Right.
Syria, Venezuela, Iran. And so far in the end, he's basically backed away from action. With Iran most recently, it was like at the very last second after he had already approved a strike. And the interesting thing about this, and this is not any kind of like Putin and Trump are talking every day about exactly what it is that Donald Trump is supposed to do, but it's that in the end, Donald Trump sort of ends up going with the position or the action, or usually it's lack of action, which does protect Russia's interests and what Vladimir Putin would prefer. So that applies to Syria, the bombing of that empty runway, which was back up and running within hours. This applies to looking super interested at going into Venezuela during the winter and then backing away from that not long after he had a conversation with Vladimir Putin in early May. And we don't know what role Russia's interests may have played in the decision to not go forward with the strike in Iran. But if that history, which now we have a couple of years of, tells us anything, it suggests ultimately Donald Trump is not going to start a war in Iran, which would go directly counter to Russia's interests.
Well, you were also kind of talking about on your show how this was kind of like what he did in business. Like he sort of just like talked a bunch of shit to try to scare people, right?
There was a lot of that. There was threats of lawsuits. There were, I think, also actual lawsuits. And Michael Cohen, his former personal attorney who's now in prison, talked about this a lot, talked about this with investigators, talked about this when he testified under oath before a House committee, I believe it was, although it may have been the Senate. So this is basically the political version of the way Donald Trump has run his businesses his entire life. He's just now taking it from whoever's doing the windows at his latest real estate project that he's negotiating with and threatening with lawsuits to other countries, world leaders, and geopolitics.
Right. You said something else I wanted to talk about on that episode where a lot of people who criticize the worst aspects of Islam are oftentimes just lumped into you're a right-wing Islamophobe, right? And I think what happens is when we lump them in with the right-wing Islamophobes and we don't give them a home on the left, they start seeking out people who agree with them, and oftentimes those people's solution is military intervention. And then, as we know, military intervention oftentimes emboldens extremists and is incredibly counterproductive.
Yeah, I actually don't remember addressing that particular element in the Iran piece, but it's something that I've definitely addressed many times before, which is we need to be able to sort of understand that in the same way that we can criticize ideas that came from Christianity, for example, without them being criticisms of all Christians or all Christian sects, it's got to be okay to apply the same sort of logic or critical thinking or criticism to any religion, Islam being one of those. I think that this is a really difficult gray area because there is a ton of bad faith argumentation here. There are people who will claim that they are just criticizing ideas, but they are doing it in a way really to demonize Muslims as people.
Yes.
And there are others who are not doing that, and many of them are on the left. So I think it's really important to understand, especially in this era of echo chambers and filter bubbles that exist on the internet and these algorithms that are recommending often very extreme content. If we don't, and I say we, if I don't, as someone decidedly on the left, make clear that no ideas are sort of off limits from criticism as long as we're being thoughtful and talking about it in good faith, people who would otherwise remain squarely on my side are going to get sucked into these right-wing echo chambers. And we know that it happens because some of them explain how it's happened to them.
Right. Well, where I was going that you did cover on your episode is I think that when you end up in that extreme, on that extreme side, you think the only answer is military, right? Is to go to war. But you pointed out on your episode, which I didn't even put together, that talk about how by Trump pulling out of the deal with Iran, that actually is what gave Iran permission to do the thing that we threatened to attack them for. Like diplomacy would have actually
worked. Barack Obama signed this Iran nuclear deal with Iran, and there were people who opposed it at the time, and even people who were generally in favor of it might have opposed specific provisions. But the word of a president, especially when you sign off on it, has to be worth something really significant if we are going to be dealt with as credible negotiators when we're talking to other countries. So for Donald Trump to come in and say, okay, the U.S. is just out, even though Iran hadn't violated any aspect of the Iran deal, even if you think that Iran is a bad actor, even if you think that Iran has bad intentions, you really are doing a lot of self-inflicted damage when you just unilaterally say, even though you've done nothing wrong, I'm getting us out of the deal. And if you're Iran, who I don't want to see get nuclear weapons,
right,
of course you start enriching uranium right away. If your intentions are to use it for nuclear power, then there's a very clear incentive to start the research as soon as possible. If your intentions are to use it to develop nuclear weapons, we know historically that having those nuclear weapons for other countries has been a valuable negotiating tool, and countries that have given them up have often ended up in worse situations. So Donald Trump precipitated Iran doing the obviously predictable thing, and then he's using that as a justification to further threaten escalation.
What do they, with Iraq, we talked about oil. What are they, besides like waving their dicks around, what is the John Boltons, Donald Trump, what do they get out of a war with Iran?
There's two sides to that. There's the financial, military, industrial complex side.
Sure.
And then there's also the sort of neocon spread democracy side of this entire thing. And those two sides often overlap. We saw them overlap significantly with the 2003 Iraq War, where you had a huge military industrial complex profit-driven side. But then you also had the idea of let's go back in and finish the job that wasn't done under George H.W. Bush, which was more sort of like the ideological side. So it's a combination of both. There's also more complicated geopolitics involved relating to Saudi Arabia, for example. And so it's multifaceted. And for Trump, I don't even know how much he knows about all of that stuff. I mean, I really do think that for Trump, a lot of this, from what we hear from insiders, is he just gets the idea of something that sounds interesting to make him look powerful and alpha. And then when it gets complicated, he just sort of gets bored with it and loses patience and sometimes moves on. I don't know how much Trump is even aware of all of these underlying elements.
Oh my God. It's like fucking another Simpsons reference when Milhouse's parents got divorced and just like driving around like a lunatic with like all the new toys and then throwing them away. But then at the same time having these longtime hawks in his administration who have been pushing for war. And I also I want to say, because I mean I guess I have talked about war a bunch on this new show, but just because there are military people and conservative people who listen, to me, I think a lot of liberals who are anti-war are categorized as these sort of like anti-troop pussies. But for me, and I would assume for you, one of the reasons that I'm against these wars is because I don't want fucking troops to die for a bunch of these elite assholes. I think that is a very pro-troop stance to not want to send them over to another bullshit war.
Of course. I am in favor of, listen, we don't have a draft because our volunteer military is large enough. And in fact, if we stopped a lot of these pointless military engagements, it would be more than large enough by many orders of magnitude. The only reason we even need or have a use for as many troops as are currently in the military is because of all the engagements we get in. So I believe that it is obviously pro-military to say we can't just say that military action is a last resort or the final option on the table. It actually has to be reflected in our foreign policy. We can't just say support the troops, but you actually have to make sure that the troops have adequate health care when they get back. I just read today that Donald Trump said some troops just aren't strong enough to deal with PTSD, which is just so horrible and toxic to say.
If Barack Obama said that, he would have been kicked out of office and imprisoned.
Right. Absolutely. And so I do support the troops in a way that is best for them rather than best for the sort of neoconservative political ideology of the right, which sees troops basically as pawns to be used in their chess game.
Okay. So last question, actually 2 more quick questions. You talked about this a lot on Rogan, the Steven Crowder YouTube algorithm. I agreed with you and I agreed with Rogan. Your face started to go viral when Joe Rogan was like, Steven Crowder's a comedian. And you looked aghast, to say the least, that he's a comedian. I think you can say that, that was definitely not like a good faith George Carlin-esque subversive joke, and Steven Crowder was being a bit homophobic, and also not be psyched to have algorithms demonetizing people on YouTube. Right after that happened, we started to see progressive journalists who have done investigative work on white supremacy get demonetized just because white supremacists came up in the algorithm. And then I only saw briefly that you had a video demonetized. I don't know why, a very popular video. Do you think that, even though YouTube is a private corporation, that the demonetization, that deplatforming, do you think that that's dangerous? Or are you kind of on the side of like, look, if you're going to be a homophobic asshole, get the fuck out, and if there are consequences, even if they affect you personally, so be it?
Well, there's 2 things here. It's really important to separate demonetization from deplatforming. If content isn't illegal or violating YouTube's terms and conditions in terms of bullying or violence, they're not deplatforming someone by demonetizing them. Now, that being said, for me, the real problem here is not the demonetization of homophobic targeting of a journalist. Okay, that is not the problem. The problem for me is what goes beyond left or right, and which I've been experiencing this week, which is that anything that touches remotely controversial topics, even in an FCC safe way, like for example, my coverage of what's going on with Iran, is because of YouTube's pro-profit bias. That's the real bias.
Yes.
It's being demonetized out of an abundance of caution, and it's hurting. I am uniquely positioned in the sense that my channel is big enough that I actually do depend on it to pay my employees, but it's not so big that we have, we're not in the CNN position, so to speak. So channels like mine are at real risk when an algorithm says anything that's remotely controversial in this way, we just won't monetize because it's affecting channels at my level disproportionately.
Right. Do you think that, because I've said this before, when it comes to talk about fake news, like being biased or who's being deplatformed, is I think a lot of it just has to do with fucking money, where the news covered Trump. If the news didn't cover Trump that much during the campaign and covered Bernie equally, I don't think Trump would have won. But now it does look like there's a liberal bias, because now the popular thing is, go after Trump. I think that the bottom line is corporations just want to profit. I don't really know if there is a left or right agenda when it comes to YouTube, when it comes to 24-hour news, and so on.
Well, it's important to distinguish editorial decisions and sort of structural bias. So, like as an example, I think there's no question that you can argue that YouTube has a progressive-leaning internal culture.
Yes.
But the question when it comes to the demonetization is, what is the motive there? And for me, there's every indication that it's just keeping advertisers happy. If it's right-wing content that's concerning to advertisers, or left-wing content, or just controversial content, that's what they're going to target so that they can tell advertisers, don't worry, your ads won't appear on that stuff. With Fox News, to give a different example of types of bias, Fox News, of course, editorially is right-wing. But they're not necessarily pro-Trump. I mean, they have been pro-Trump for the last couple of years. But remember, at the beginning of the 2016 Republican primary, Fox News was not pro-Trump. And in fact, Trump and Fox News were really butting heads. Eventually, Fox made the business decision that they were going to jump on the Trump train. And then again, depending on how the next 6 months go, Fox News will continue being right-wing, but they won't necessarily continue being pro-Trump.
Oh, right. And then let's take the other extreme, too, how people say that MSNBC is the left-wing equivalent of Fox News. It's like, number one, we have like 23 hours of fucking Joe Scarborough. Number two, they forget that after September 11th, the only anti-war voices were fired from MSNBC for that same reason. Fox News was taking off in the ratings with American flags, fuck yeah, America. And then we had Phil Donahue on MSNBC being like, maybe we should go to Iraq, and they fucking fired him. So, like, how left-wing is that?
Yeah, no question about it. And ultimately, yes, editorially, MSNBC has what you would call like a sort of establishment Democrat center-left stance. But at its core, it is a big corporate media outlet controlled by a huge company just like Fox News. And I think that that's what people often miss when they just say, well, Chris Matthews seems sort of left, and it's sort of the same as Tucker being right-wing on Fox News.
Right.
There are ways in which it's similar, and there are ways in which the dynamics at play are very different.
Yeah. All right, last question. This is just for me as dummy high school dropout becoming a new fan of yours. How fucking much do you read? You are one of the most intelligent people I've ever talked to, and I have so much trouble retaining this much. I legitimately, not hyperbolically, not trying to be funny, how much reading goes into your prep for the show and just to have? Because goddamn, dude, you are like really well versed in everything.
Thanks. Well, I actually feel as if I'm not nearly well versed enough, interestingly enough, in a lot of areas, which is why I try rather, I do read news, but I really only read news when I'm specifically preparing for a specific episode of the show. Otherwise, I barely watch any TV news, and I don't really watch any other news and politics on YouTube other than stuff I'm critiquing or talking about. And I try to mostly read a lot of nonfiction, whether it's science, philosophy, sociology, psychology, because I feel like that stuff is like the foundation of the pyramid that lets me analyze the other stuff. So I try to focus more on that type of reading than keeping up with every bit of news.
Oh, I love that. So kind of like, why they say you're supposed to go to college to like learn how to think. You're not necessarily reading like every brand new political book on the new sort of controversy of the day, but you'd rather read philosophy and just sharpen your brain so when you do attack those issues, you're kind of more prepared.
Yeah, I mean, I don't read any political books. I maybe read like 3 political books a year. I'm trying to think. The last one I read, I don't even remember what it was. But like the type of stuff I'm reading is right now I'm reading like Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark, which is about artificial intelligence.
Oh, and this makes me so happy.
How we're going to be prepared for that. I recently read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, which is a very interesting book about how different populations did well and not so well in human history. And this stuff I just see as kind of like the foundation to really even be able to understand the news.
Do you ever catch yourself, because I debate sometimes when I'm getting stories, because I don't, when I'm doing a lot of stand-up, I don't watch stand-up. I'm kind of the same with you. I don't, want to watch news shows or other personalities, as much just because I don't want to be influenced. But I still do find myself, I wonder, all right, what's the best way to get stories? Do I go to CNN, The Intercept, and Quillette and try to grab a bunch of different types? Or do I go to Twitter to see what everyone's talking about? Because I don't want to get sucked into 24-hour news. I'm sure I'll watch the fucking debates just because I have to. But how do you kind of gather your stories? Do you have go-to sites? Do you want to see what people are talking about so you can give your take?
Yeah, I have a very limited list of people I follow on Twitter, which I will take a glance at what's being discussed, and a lot of them are just sort of like news feeds, so I can get a sense of what is happening. And then I have like a private multi-Reddit with some very niche news-related and politics-related subreddits that are good sources to see what certain enclaves in the political world are talking about. And, I'm only doing 6 stories a day. So from all of that stuff, there's always 6 things to talk about.
Well, Pakman, you're a fucking nerd, but I admire the shit out of that. That's awesome. That's really, really cool. Well, listen, man, I really hope that listeners of the show check you out. I hope the more conservative ones check you out. I really, really enjoy it, and I just appreciate you coming on, man. It was cool to finally talk.
Absolutely. Really appreciate you having me on.
Anything, I promoted the podcast, but I totally forgot. Your YouTube channel is kind of what you're known for. Besides the podcast, what do you want to promote?
Yeah, just davidpakman.com has the audio and the video and the podcast feed and all of that stuff. So that's the best place to follow the show.
Okay, cool. And then we're on Patreon. This podcast is, but you also have a program to support. Your content's free, but you have a program on your website to support your show as well, correct? It's like $6 a month or something?
That's right. JoinPakman.com takes you directly to the membership sign up, it's our number one funding source. And, thanks to the growth in those paid subscribers, we're at least slightly insulated from the YouTube demonetization stuff. It still does affect us, but a little bit less than it would if we didn't have that membership program in place.
Awesome. Cool, man. And I'm totally taking that as inspiration for our podcast as we build it up. It's cool to see someone who talks as freely as you do, doing so well and supporting yourself and a staff. So keep it up, man. And if you ever need anything, reach out.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, brother. Oh my God, what a little smarty pants. Guys, go follow David Pakman. He's on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, iTunes, and the show website he just promoted. And once again, if you liked this show, or if you disagreed with the show, but liked the conversation, and you want to support more media like this, like the David Pakman Show, to support our show, you can go to patreon.com/Jamie Kilstein Podcast. We are like $650-ish away from doubling the show episode every day, making it an hour, so you'll get more stories, more political stories, and also being able to afford a new computer so it doesn't shut down like it did today and almost lose this interview. No big deal. And also video equipment, so the YouTube channel can finally get up and running. We can buy lights, and we can start to video podcast all of this as well, which you can subscribe to now. I still have a channel for my YouTube, youtube.com/Jamie Kilstein. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Patreon episode will come sometime this week as we move to Arizona. And for everybody else who's not a patron, we will see you with a new episode on Monday. So go outside and don't be a dick.